President Cyril Ramaphosa leading South Africa's participation in the BRICS Summit that's taking place this week. Now, this year's virtual summit will be hosted by China. And let's get more now. We're joined by the Forbes Executive Chief Economist. That's Isaah Mhlanga, who talks to us via the virtual platform. Mr. Mhlanga, thank you very much for your patience while we exited that media briefing. Let's start with whether the groups, or should I say the BRICS group of countries that form the BRICS formation, which include in it South Africa, does it still hold significant value for us as a country to still be in that formation? If so, why?
Thanks, Chloe, for having me. I think in today's multipolar world that is characterized by visible contrasts in levels of development and future aspirations between advanced economies and developing and emerging economies, the BRICS countries are a necessary institution that must foster a common development agenda for developing economies, while allowing or pushing for a differentiated approach. It does matter quite a lot. Let me just highlight some of the differences that exist that need a convergence. You can see a clear divide between the global north and the global south. In the current events that are taking place in Ukraine, you can also see Russia and China on the one side, Europe and the US on the other side. You can also look into the issues of climate change and net zero, the West's push for a faster decarbonization, which is essentially a faster end to the use of coal on the one side, and poorer nations, mostly African, Latin American, but also Asia, yearning for energy security and development on the other side. We saw again during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the rich countries hoarding vaccines, while poor nations were in dire needs to save lives and livelihoods. So it's quite clear that the world is really in a polarized environment where a convergence to a common development path is necessary. The BRICS countries play that coordinating function for the poorer countries, for emerging markets, to say they too need a stake in how the global agenda is shaped. And you can see in also some of the institutional frameworks. Take the UN Security Council, for instance. You have a lot of European countries. The UK is there, but also as a permanent member, China, France, Russia, and the United States. Those are the only permanent members, which still reflect the post-World War II global architects. It has not changed in the last 77 years, but the world has changed fundamentally. You look at the G20 in Africa, you only have South Africa as part of it, which means it leaves out 1.1 billion people in the African continent that are not represented, whose aspirations are not represented. You can look at the World Bank, the IMF, as well as multilateral institutions. Only about 5 countries constitute over 40% of the voting share, which means 60% of the world is not properly represented. So the BRICS nations actually tries to foster an inclusive and sustainable development for much of the neglected world in an environment where, quite the rich countries are leading and merely giving marching orders to the developing nations.
You've set out the geopolitics quite well, Mr. Mhlanga, and you've helped with that because we're not going to belabor that. But here is what is on everybody's minds, and that is that Russia is under heavy sanctions at the moment from European countries, including that the United States. Does that weaken this formation, the BRICS formation? And if so, how do they get themselves back at the level, let's say, pre-COVID conditions and pre the Ukraine situation?
Actually, it does not necessarily weaken the BRICS formation as an institution, though we need to admit that Russia as a country is going to suffer the consequences of the sanctions that are being imposed by the West. And of course, we need to accept that the humanitarian crisis that is happening in Ukraine could have been avoided and can be ended quicker. But as far as the BRICS institution is concerned, remember this is a grouping of countries that represent about 3 billion people, 40% of the global population. So there is no way we can wish away 40% of the global population in terms of their common aspirations for development. So it does not weaken the importance and the leading role to try and foster a multilateral world where poorer countries are more represented and get a fair share at the development path that the future is likely to take.
I want us to conclude this important conversation. So we stopped at the moment where I was saying that South Africa's own interests in the BRICS formation, we obtained an 86 billion rand loan, and that was to try and weather the COVID-19 storm. Might that make it difficult for South Africa to exit this formation if it wanted to exit? I'm not saying we are there.
Tony, I think we are trying to make a storm out of a teacup as far as the 86 billion loan is concerned. Let me contextualize it this way. It is only 1.3% of our GDP. It is about 4.4% of our total expenditure. And as a proportion of the total debt portfolio that we have as a country, it is 1.8%. In any case, South Africa borrows from the market, from the bond markets, on a weekly basis, over 7 billion rand. On a weekly basis. Which means if you put that 86 billion rand in context, then it means it's not something that we should be really making a lot of noise. But put differently, loans from the New Development Bank, or the BRICS Bank as it's commonly known, are low-cost interest loans, also similar to what we get from the World Bank and the IMF. So the discussion of loans from the BRICS Bank should be coupled with the loans from the IMF and the World Bank, because there are development institutions that offer financing at low interest rates. And by the way, we subscribe to these institutions, which means we have a right to access funding when we need the funding in times of need at a low cost. Now, if you consider the normal credit approach, if you need to borrow, you first consider where the loans are cheap in terms of the interest rates, and we do have loans that are cheap from the New Development Bank, the IMF, and the World Bank. It would not make financial sense to let go of financing that we have a right because you pay a subscription fee and go to the bond markets where you are going to pay 10.5% if you take the 10-year bond yield. It wouldn't make sense. So I think this discussion is just blown out of proportion without understanding the context within which it happens. It is financing that we have the right to, that is cheaper, that have a developmental mandate to it.
Well, it is those very powerful financial interests, Isaah Mhlanga, that make people panic. Why am I using the word panic? President Joe Biden of the United States, this was in February when Russia invaded Ukraine, he mentioned this word, that Russia would be seen as a pariah on the world stage if it did not stop what it was doing against Ukraine. And I'm saying this in the context that we borrow from those markets, whether it be in European countries or the US. The worry here, I suppose, is the fear that we might be punished by the US and the European countries that stand diametrically opposed to what Russia has done.
Look, I think here we are conflating issues. the summit is not a South Africa-Russia summit. It's a BRICS summit, which means there are other countries beyond Russia. Russia is merely a member. If your argument or your line of questioning was valid, then as part of the G20, South Africa should be punished, and all the other countries that are part of the G20 alongside Russia, as part of the IMF, the World Bank, and of which Russia is also part to that, all the other countries should be punished. So we should not actually say South Africa will be punished because it's part of the BRICS, of which Russia is also part of the BRICS. There are many other countries that are in economic blocks of which Russia is also part that are not going to be punished. Maybe let me take you to a statement that President Mandela once said when he was in the US, when he was posed a question on whether South Africa should continue to deal with Libya. And he simply said, the assumption that the US enemies are South Africa's enemies is wrong. And I think that still holds today. But as far as the discussion that we are having on Ukraine is concerned, BRICS is an institution, it's not Russia. And therefore, countries that are part of the BRICS are not going to be penalized merely because they are members of the BRICS nation.
Isaah Mhlanga, a very, very strong stance indeed. Thank you very much for your insight on this matter.